This piece is from January 4th, 2017. It was originally titled Stand Up Comedy is Dead. The new title is Stand Up Comedy is Dead. Long Live Beyond Comedy. Dave Chappelle is being criticized for a recent comedy performance. People feel that they are disrespected by what he said. For purposes of this piece, the nature of their grievances hardly matter. The problem is not only in the alleged grievances against the performer, it lies in the form itself. I know of two changes in the nature of post-World War II stand-up comedy in the United States, and now we are on the cusp of a third. I'm sure there are more changes. I could write about them, I suppose, but I will just discuss what is relevant to the piece that I'm writing here. Starting point. Seltzer bottles and mugging. Immediately after World War II, comedians were just silly, broad slapstick antics, shrill voices, lots of making faces. Milton Berle was the most prominent. Jerry Lewis was the last, probably the best of this breed. In all of this discussion, I will use big stars as a means of illustration. The scores of other performers in each era work primarily in the same way. So this really isn't focused on the stars. And also, I won't discuss people who work in a manner before their own time. So no digressions, excuse me, no digressions about Lord Buckley and the like. My purpose is to make a cultural observation here, not to critique individual comedians. Inflection point one, the emergence of sophistication. A new kind of comedian emerged in the mid-1950s. The Compass Players in early Second City were a large part of this development. Compass and Second City were not stand-up operations, but they spawned some revolutionary stand-ups. Comedy became intelligent and satiric. Bob Newhart, Shelley Berman, Nichols and May, Woody Allen, Jonathan Winters, Robert Klein, David Steinberg, many others, but these were comedians who were very smart about cultural and political matters and human psychology. They made sharp observations, but were not agents of social change. They made ironic comments about what most in their audience agreed was an imperfect but pretty good world, all in all. Of course, prophets also worked in this time, like Lenny Bruce and Dick Gregory. But these comics, Bruce and Gregory, were also before their time. Inflection point two, the time of paradox, comedians as rock stars and as leaders of social change. The incredible success of Saturday Night Live was an earthquake in comedy. John Belushi and Dan Aykroyd filmed the Blues Brothers in Chicago when I was on the main stage at Second City in Chicago. And they came and hung out around the theater. They had both worked either in Chicago or Toronto for Second City. So they hung around the theater for a brief time during the shooting of that show and soon opened a private club of their own across the street. They were as popular as the Beatles. Something was lost in this transition. Comedians in any era were always, comedy in any era was always about lovable losers who struggled. Comedy, Charlie Chaplin, and the 1940s Bob Hope, was a representation of humanity as a giant collective fool who, by dint of love or resourcefulness or some other positive human characteristic, prevailed in spite of all its, well, human faults and frailties. That changed with SNL. Comedians now were people of power. They were rich, and they had an influential voice. SNL stars largely used that power to be rich, famous, popular. SNL was all about success. Yes, SNL stars were stand-ups, but some of them were actually. All of them weren't, obviously. But they had a great influence on how the audience perceived stand-ups. And Steve Martin's mega popularity in the mid 1970s was a stand-up equivalent to SNL. And of course, he still has a very long association with the show. But in the 1970s, he was a comedian who could fill basketball arenas. Now, the most interesting development at this cultural moment came out of what two stand-ups, again, these are all just for example, did with their fame and power. Richard Pryor and George Carlin used stand-up as a means to be artists and to assert cultural, political, and moral leadership through their comedy, which was unfailingly hilarious. And this tone in comedy marked the high water mark of stand-up as an art form. The next era was the age of repetition. And then comedy stayed the same for years. This isn't unusual in any way. Stand-up trends were like trends in popular music. A great revolutionary sound emerges, Sinatra, Elvis, the Beatles, etc. And then we listen to it from many artists for a few generations until something new happens. Some superficial formal changes happen, but nothing essentially transforms. There has been no transformation in improvisation either as a performance form. The biggest changes in improv have come in its applications, mainly in the field of education and in its popularity, particularly as a participatory activity. People seem more interested in improvising themselves than in watching it. New formal changes occur in improv as in music, and over the years heard so many. Herald, long form, I don't know what they are now, blah, blah, blah. Each generation thinks they've done something different and chauvinistically think that they do it better, when really no one has ever fundamentally changed or improved upon what Paul Sills and David Shepard were up to at the Compass in the 1950s. I can't help but digress here. Improvisers should pick up their game in this regard. Viola Spolin said that the soul of improvisation is revolution and transformation. She said improvisation should turn into something new. It certainly has for individuals who have become writers, actors, directors, CEOs, etc., after a good training in improvisation. But the form itself can be much more. Improvisers either revere the past in an unhealthy way, of course the founder should be honored, or they compete with the past and claim superiority to it, when their actual work demonstrates very little that supports that claim. So in the age of repetition, we have big stand-up stars today, like Stephen Colbert, for example. He does monologues, if you're balking at the classification, that have a social consciousness. But like Xerox copies, all repetitions are a bit faded. Colbert is famous, but not like the Beatles or the Blues Brothers were. Colbert has power, but societal power, but not like Pryor or Carlin. He has a corporate job. He's not a totally unfettered voice. Colbert doesn't exert the leadership of Pryor or Carlin either. He is limited to having some of his sharply pointed jokes, real social comments, presented as a sideshow on the news. He's not dangerous like Pryor or Carlin. People actually changed after listening to those guys. None of this is Colbert's fault. He is doing what he can with this cultural moment, or at least this commercial moment. Which brings us back to Dave Chappelle. Stand-up comedy is dead. Chappelle missed with his recent comments because he is fiercely holding on to a form which is no longer viable. He wants to communicate only through the joke. It is what he identifies with. The joke is a literary form born of oppression. Good jokes make fun of the powerful. Bad jokes mock the weak. The joke has always been an instrument of near justice. The joke has always been a way of dealing with injustice. but not the ultimate answer to it. Pryor and Carlin awakened outrage, and that was a huge change. Outrage is necessary for personal and social change as a first step. But we are now past the time of prophecy. The collective soul is screaming for justice. People don't want to just mitigate their suffering, they want to end it. And the times are complex. We all have some oppressed and some oppressor within us at the moment, our inner oppressed and our inner oppressor. We allowed our politics and culture to get to this promising moment of crisis. The joke can be a part of a presentation to an audience, but it doesn't work as the whole thing. The consciousness of the world has made a big leap in the past 2 years, and stand-up comedy is a casualty of that leap. Things have to be destroyed in order to create the new. I had a 19-year-old kid work as a stage manager on the last iteration of my stage show, which was entitled The Death of a Nation. And even he would have to admit that he has a lot to learn about stage managing and maybe won't pursue it. He's a good young composer and musician. But he brought a wonderful spirit to the show. He gave me one of the most instructive comments that I've heard about my work. I love how the show can be very funny and become very serious and intense, he said. I love how the show can be very political and then get very personal. You tell jokes, make poetry, analyze things, teach, and tell a lot of stories. There are all sorts of characters. It's moving and thought-provoking. It works on so many levels. That 19-year-old is the voice of the future. Now, I had a director for that show, too. We mutually decided not to continue to work together. I am immune to direction. I can only do what feels true to me. So I listen to people, but I ultimately do what I want. And I'm sure this was very frustrating for the director. The writer, me, is primary in my world. From now on, I will direct myself. There's a power in that. I had a power in my last show too, but too much unnecessary arguing. Story of my life. Being told to do something which goes against my deepest beliefs leads to legitimate rebellion. When I am dead and put in the ground, no director will go into the hole with me. The director, to his credit, said as much when we started. But we tried, and I got a lot out of it, and I thank him for that. We had a major creative difference. The director thinks stand-up is still alive. He mentioned a stand-up that he admired, Paul F. Tompkins, as someone who is very aware of everything happening in the room when he works. I wasn't sure as to why he brought Tompkins up. I think that is a strength of mine as well. That I had seen a little of Tompkins on TV, but really didn't know his work. I looked him up on YouTube. I only lasted for about 3 minutes as I watched Tompkins. I thought his act was excrement. And I'm not criticizing Tompkins. I'm not going after him personally. Well, I guess I am, but it's just to make a point. I have nothing against the guy. I hated his show because stand-up is dead. Tompkins wasn't present in the room. He had some arch, affected, calculated persona that was inauthentic. His tone was defined by what he thought people would find funny. And Tompkins started talking about a funeral that he attended in a very superficial way. He was trying to shock and trying to be glib. The only thing the writer-performer standing on stage in front of people should be going for is the exploration of the truth, period. I wasn't offended by Tompkins. I just felt it was a waste of time. I had moments in my show as recently as July 2017 that resembled Tompkins' inauthentic manner. I had this idea that I would organize my show in 3 acts: stand-up, analysis, story, and poetry. But that didn't work either. A piece has its own creative logic. I started the Rick blog with the idea that at last I could unleash all the disparate parts of my personality on the world. I keep getting better at doing that. Genre is a trap. My friend, the director, who was very generous with his time through most of the experience, understandably lost interest at the end of our common project, and that's more than okay. It was good to oppose his ideas. Art needs openings and obstructions to form itself. One thing I tried to do was go to storytelling and stand up venues in order to polish segments of the show. And the director encouraged me to continue to do so. That direction ultimately received an emphatic no from me. He accused me of repeating myself in the negative. But in my defense, he kept bringing it up. Go to this venue. No. Go to that venue. No. Go to the other venue. No. I really dislike those stand up storytelling type shows. I would never go listen to them as an audience. And in playing them, I felt like a jazz musician appearing with the Archies. I went to one show and people balked at the fact that there were moments of anger in my set. I was told to be more like a woman who told a story about fucking a rock star at a concert when she was young. I went to one show that demanded strict time limits. Time limits are a good exercise, but I'm beyond that. A piece should be concise, I guess, but its length should really be determined by its content. I always felt uncomfortable and pissed off at these shows because of their superficiality. Most of the acts were pretty dumb. You might think that I didn't get laughs at these venues given the bitterness of my observations or the bitter soundingness. The bitterness, they sound bitter. I'm not bitter. I actually killed at these places. I got big laughs. I was a popular act. Even at the place where they had issues with my moments of anger, the audience loved me. If you aren't angry at this moment in history, something's wrong with you. No, I was great at doing their shows, but I wasn't doing my work. So I learned I need spaces where I can work autonomously and speak my truth without the interference of other people's rules and expectations. The, the included photo, you can look it up on the Rick blog if you want to see it, was taken at my last performance to date by the bad stage manager who was also a wonderful oracle. It's a picture of the future. Stand-up comedy is dead. Long live beyond comedy. Copyright 2018, Richard Thomas. And I think I misspoke at the beginning of this thing. This is from January 2018. Okay.